So Kentucky just went through a turbulent election. There was between the Republicans, you had 4 candidates, and the top 2 candidates were 83 votes. It was one of the closest elections in Kentucky history. So traditionally, what had actually happened in 1992, there was an amendment that was passed, and it changed all the rules for the governor and lieutenant governor and some other things. And it changed one of the main rules that I want to talk about right now is it changed the runoff requirement. So in 1992, the amendment was presented to Kentuckians. Kentuckians voted for it, and then it was enacted into law. One of the changes that it changed was that the governor couldn't secede himself anymore, was repealed. So now he could secede himself. Throughout Kentucky's history, you can only have 1 term, and then you couldn't secede after that, but you could secede after the next one. So you just couldn't have 2 successive terms. And it stopped a lot of people actually from being reelected several times. I think we only had about maybe total 5 governors that have actually served 2 terms, and that's including Steve Beshear and Paul Patton. And so they were the first beneficiaries of the 1992 amendment. Bree Retton Jones was the governor that it was assigned under, but it specifically exempted him so that he couldn't secede after himself. So 1992, we passed this pretty much sweeping amendment for, and also lieutenant governor, something about whenever the governor would leave, then the lieutenant governor was in power. It wiped that part out. And then it also removed the lieutenant governor's duties in the Senate. Before, the lieutenant governor had cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. Now the lieutenant governor didn't have that power. So 1992 changed all that. And so the runoff provision that was added in 1992 said that if one of the candidates didn't receive 80% of the vote, or 40% of the vote, my bad. So that's not even a majority. That's a plurality, right? If you are typically, or what had happened with the election with the Republicans, the primary, if you had the most votes, you're going to be declared the winner. But if this provision was still in place, but in 2008 it was repealed, if it was still in place, then James Comer and Matt Bevin would undergo a runoff. And so what that would do is it would take the Will T. Scott supporters and the Hal Heiner supporters. They wouldn't vote for their guys because it was between just Comer and Bevin, you know, since they're the top 2 vote getters. So the supporters of Will T. and Hal Heiner could now reevaluate where they wanted to, you know, who their allegiance or their, you know, their alliance would lie with. And that's sort of like instant runoff voting in a way. So anyways, I was kind of curious, where did this law go? This law would have solved this problem. 83 votes is very close. We may never know who actually won the primary. We assume the electronic machines are doing their job, unless, you know, somebody got in and typed with a code. Then, you know, who can tell with that, you know? So, in the reason why the runoff provision was wiped out was because of Steve Beshear. Now, Steve Beshear, he had won in 2007 for his first term by 41%. There was talk that he wouldn't make the 40% threshold, and if he didn't make the 40% threshold, he would have had to have a runoff election against Bruce Lunsford, who was the number 2 vote getter, even though he only got 21%. So basically, Steve Beshear, you know, just creamed the competition, you know, by 20 points. But if you were to take Steve Henry, Jody Richards, Gatewood Galbraith, and Otis Hensley's votes and added all of them together, and all of them had voted for Bruce Lunsford would have been our governor. So Steve Beshear narrowly avoided a runoff election in 2007. After he narrowly, you know, won the 2007 primary, then he goes to November and wins the general election. And then that January 2008, Congress, the General Assembly, puts forth the repeal of the Runoff Act. And they pass it. Eventually, he signs it into law in April. But they had it was right after he had got elected, right after he had narrowly avoided almost losing. So in January 2008, it says 4:30 p.m. the House passes bill to eliminate runoff primary. The Kentucky House voted 92-3. So nearly unanimous, 92%, right? There's 100 representatives in the House today to repeal a state law that requires the top vote getter in a gubernatorial primary who receives less than 40% of the vote to face off in a runoff primary with the second highest vote getter. So actually it was mandated by law that, Will T. Scott and Hal Heiner would have been dropped out, and then that would have forced their voters and maybe some other people who was paying attention to vote for either Comer or Bevin. I think that would have been more fair. 83 votes. If that's, accurate, then he wins. And hopefully there were no irregularities. But how do you find out if there were irregularities? There's vote buying schemes happening all the time. People getting alcohol. And so 4:30 p.m. in January 2008, they, under House Bill 18, sponsored by Representative Darrell T. Owens, the candidate with the most votes in the primary, whether their percentage of the vote is above 40% or not, would win the primary and move on to the general election. The bill now goes to the Senate for its consideration. The bill permits the candidate with the highest number of votes on each slate to be the nominee of the respective parties, said Owens. Since being instituted for the 1995 governor's race, the runoff provision has never been triggered. So it never even used. It was just when William Goebel got the nomination, he says, well, is it an absolute majority? If it's not absolute majority, then let's revote. Until he got the absolute majority. That's how you unify all the Democrats. And I think that would have been a tremendous race. It would have been incredible to see the runoff in 2007. He narrowly avoided it, so he was able to beat the 40% threshold, but Matt Bevin and James Comer did not. They got 33% of the vote. So they would have, that would have triggered the runoff, but unfortunately the House and the Senate had passed this in January 2008, then it gets signed in April 2008, and now it's gone. There was no need for it. We didn't need it. In fact, this is an anti-democracy measure. This shreds our democracy. It wasn't a thing. I mean, this would be a crazy issue to run on. Vote for me and I'll make sure that primaries never have a runoff election. That's not, that's one of those bills you slip in. You don't actually talk about it publicly. You slip it in real quietly because you don't know, even if the people knew about it, if they would even get excited about something like this. And it's an anti-democracy measure. So, I would be opposed to something. I'm opposed to it right now. It pisses me off. I wish we did have the runoff primary. Like I said, then not only would we have fixed this last election to where, it'd been more fair, you'd have Bevin versus Comer, and then they would actually get, the majority of the Republicans on their side instead of having a four-way sort of, a piecemeal type of Republican primary. Some had their, candidates who didn't win. And so anyways, it's a good unifier thing. It's good for democracy. It gets people excited, and it gives people another chance to say who they actually wanted. Let's assume that, what would have happened if Will T. Scott voters and Hal Heiner voters would have gone for Comer. Comer would win hands down easily. A lot of people voted for those two candidates, and so they, in a way, they threw their votes away. They threw their votes away by voting for those guys because it wasn't even down, to the wire between them two. It was down to the wire between the other two. So if they weren't in the race, where would those votes have actually gone to? Instant runoff voting would have actually prevented this. Instant runoff voting is something I believe very strong in because it allows you to vote for who you believe in your heart to be, who should be the best. But if they don't win in the top two spots, then your vote goes to your second preference choice. And so if you had 5 options, you could vote 1, 2, 3, which one you think is your favorite. Number 1, I love Jill Stein. Jill Stein gets 5% of the vote. Okay, she doesn't win. My vote, my Jill Stein vote gets thrown away, but it gets reincarnated to my second preference, which would be, Bernie Sanders over Ted Cruz. And so by voting for Jill Stein, if magically she didn't just get the majority, I didn't throw my vote away. I wouldn't have thrown my vote away if I voted for Hal Heiner or Will T. or, Young Masters. So because, with the instant runoff voting, it goes, well, with only 2, it's a little bit different. But with 4, your Will T. Scott vote is a good principled vote, but he lost. And so your second preference, if it was James Comer wins. Or perhaps the second preference for both Hal Heiner and Will T. Scott voters would have been Matt Bevin. And if it was for Matt Bevin, then he would have, won hands down with the voters of Hal Heiner and Will T. Scott. So he would have gotten more supporters, more Republicans who backed him. I think that the reason why it was taken away was because Steve Beshear almost lost. He almost lost in 2007 because he didn't lose. He almost had to do another runoff primary. And he was like, oh man, I don't want to have to do all that. And so let's never have to worry about this ever again. But that's ridiculous. If you had 10 candidates and one candidate got 11%, well, you got 1,000 people voted for you. So you become the nominee for the party. House Bill 18 was signed by D. Owens, M. Cherry, L. Clark, R. Meeks, C. Miller, and T. Reiner. An act relating to the runoff primary, amend KRS 118-245 to eliminate the runoff primary for gubernatorial slates, amend various sections to conform. There are some amendments. David Williams, amend various sections of KRS 118, various sections. This is so imprecise. To change the filing deadline for presidential candidates to 45 days before the presidential preference primary. So they're changing the date of the presidential primary, which has nothing to do with the runoff, right? But that's a rider. That's how they do it, these amendment riders. Change the presidential preference primary date to the first Tuesday in February. Create a new section of KRS Chapter 118 to require the Secretary of State to make a recommendation to the State Board of Elections to change the date of the presidential preference primary under certain conditions. Require the State Board of Elections to give notice to the Legislative Research Commission if the date of the presidential preference primary is to change. Require the State Board of Elections to promulgate administrative regulations and establish procedures for election officials to follow. Two other amendment riders filed by David Williams, 2008, to make a title amendment. And then another one was amend various sections of KRS Chapters 83A, 116, 117, 118, 118A, 119, and 121 to change the filing deadline for candidates and primaries from the last Tuesday in January to the last Tuesday in April. Change the date of the primary from the first Tuesday after the third Monday in May to the first Tuesday after the third Monday in August. What the fuck did they just do to our Constitution? What did they just do to our electoral system? We all voted in 92 to have it a certain way, but then, just the legislature can go in and just gut everything that we actually wanted to be done. So instant runoff voting, I already explained a little bit, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more because that's the policy recommendation that I have to solve this. It increases, last year there was no Democrats who ran against Beshear. This year you only had, one long shot candidate. And then, we need more choices. We need more options and choices. That's the way that the Democratic Party is going to be reinvigorated. We need to have fair elections where we have debates, and we should have public finance of elections too. Get all that big money out of politics. So instant runoff voting would solve a lot of the issues for independents and Greens and Libertarians to vote for their heart, and perhaps their heart will be the same as the majority of their Kentuckians, or their vote will be dropped and then it'll go to one of the main two candidates. So instant runoff voting, also called alternative vote, transferable vote, ranked choice voting, or preferential voting, is an electoral system used to elect a single winner from a field of more than two candidates. It is a preferential voting system in which voters rank the candidates in order to preference rather than voting for a single candidate. So you get more options, right? You get to rank them. There's 5 choices. You get to say who are the top 3 in the Republican Party. So you can say Will T was number 1, and then James Comer number 2, or Bevin number 2, and Comer number 3. And like I said before, your Will T. Scott, after he lost on May 19th, would get thrown out, and then it would go to the second preference. And that's how it would be an instant runoff voting. And so there wouldn't have to be another election. Just when you go to the ballot, you would have to just rank 1, 2, 3 right then and there. So the formula, the algorithm kind of does the second voting without actually undergoing an entire new voting process. So it's genius. Ballots are initially distributed based on each elector's first preference. If a candidate secures more than half the votes cast, that candidate wins. So again, it forces a majority of the candidates to vote for one, the majority of the voters to vote for one candidate. And it goes on, they keep on, let's say we had a list of 10 people who ran, it would just keep on knocking the loser off until the bottom bracket person redistribute those votes. And if there's not a majority, then knock the next person off and then redistribute those votes until eventually a winner emerges. And they would be forced to get a majority, to be Democratic, to be elected by the majority. We only have, Matt Bevin only got 2% of Kentucky's entire electorate. And then Jack Conway only got 4%. So, the voter turnout rate was very small to begin with, but even with the very small voter turnout rate, they didn't even, Matt Bevin didn't even win the majority of the 2%. So 2% of Kentucky Republicans, or the elector, 2% of all of Kentucky's registered voters voted in the GOP primary. And then out of that 2%, that voted in the GOP primary, 33% of them voted for Matt Bevin. And so 33% of 2%, that is, just 0.066. So 0.066% of Kentucky's entire electorate voted for Matt Bevin. So that's why he got the Republican nomination. The instant runoff voting has the effect of avoiding split votes when multiple candidates earn support from like-minded voters. For example, suppose that there are two similar candidates, A and B. I've already explained it, but again, it doesn't split the votes. So if I want to vote for my Jill Stein and she doesn't get the majority of the votes, my votes aren't lost. And so it encourages people to vote for their hearts first and then for the person that they think might have a better shot of actually winning the thing. And I think that's a good thing. We should vote for what we want, not for something we fear. We shouldn't vote for the lesser of the two evils. We should vote for something that, we should be excited and happy for when we go vote. When I vote for Jill Stein, I feel good about myself because I voted for a principled person and I showed that the Republicans and the Democrats, they haven't won my vote. You have to start speaking my issues until you can win my vote. Instant runoff voting is used to elect members of the Australian House of Representatives and most Australian state governments, the President of India, members of legislative councils in India, the President of Ireland, and the Parliament in Papua New Guinea. So Australia, India, Ireland, Papua New Guinea. It's also used in Northern Ireland, by-elections for electing hereditary peers for the British House of Lords. So that it's good for the House of Lords, right? The aristocracy in Britain, but not for the Commons. I mean, that seems crazy to me. The system is also used in local elections around the world to elect the mayor in cities such as London in the United Kingdom in the variant known as a supplementary vote, and Dunedin and Wellington in New Zealand. So a couple towns, right? London's not a town, it's a city. But Dunedin, Wellington, and New Zealand, variants of instant runoff voting are employed by several jurisdictions in the United States, including San Francisco, San Leandro, and Oakland in California, Portland, Maine, Minneapolis, and St. Paul in Minnesota. These are very progressive, high GDP, good Silicon Valley, so lots of opportunities, and these are really good. Minneapolis has a great education system. They have the $10 internet for everybody in Minneapolis can just sign up onto, the Minneapolis internet, whatever the city is called, but it's just $10, so it's dirt cheap, and then everybody has access. St. Paul and Minneapolis. So in Minnesota. And then Portland, right? One of the most progressive places. San Francisco, Oakland, San Leandro. The single transferable vote, a multi-seat form of instant runoff voting, is used in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that's where Harvard's at. It is used to elect the leaders of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom and was used in elections in 2013 for the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada and in Canada's new Democratic Party leadership election 2012. Many private associations also use instant runoff voting, including the Hugo Awards for Science Fictions and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in selection of the Oscar for Best Picture. So even if you don't know shit about politics, take a look at the Oscars. How are they voted? Well, there's top 5, and you vote your heart in preference, and if you don't go, your heart doesn't, win, and then it goes to Titanic or something, but the Oscars, it's the most fair way to vote. You actually get a runoff voting, let's assume actually the number 1 preference wins right out. Well, you don't even have to have a runoff election, but you already have a runoff election, like you've done it in advance. If in case this doesn't happen, what do you want to happen? You've already made that decision. And so it increases your choices. You get you get a wider base of candidates. More people will be encouraged to run. It's just everywhere on its face. There's like no downsides to this. Except for it changes the electoral system. But that's it. If you're just terrified of change. But we've changed the electoral system in Kentucky. We did it in 92. We totally changed it. And then we did it in 2008 to undo, one of the major changes that we changed in 92. So, we're always changing these rules. Instant runoff voting is described in Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised 10th edition. So, instant runoff voting is the best system to be employed in a democracy, an electoral democracy. So we need to have instant runoff voting. We should have had the runoff primaries enacted. I don't know why it was repealed. I do know why. I think it's because the people who sponsored it are just a bunch of kiss asses. Beshear had almost, I can understand why. If he was a principled man, he wouldn't have gone for it. But he had said, well, shit, I almost lost. And he doesn't want to be faced with that. Almost losing again, winning the election, but doing it by like Matt Bevin, only 33%, 39%. You had to get 40%. And if you don't break the 40% threshold, then a runoff election would have to happen. So he changed it. Steve Beshear completely changed it. And that's, that suggests sort of a totalitarian rule. And I like Lincoln when he came in, it was a strong fist and, wiped out slavery. I liked when Beshear implemented Common Core. I liked it when Beshear implemented Obamacare with a strong fist, just said, this is the right thing to do, we're doing it. And I really like that when he is strong-arm about the issues that I agree with. But what do we do when he just says, okay, let's start throwing all these Jews into the gas, into the gas concentration camps, right? Let's start gassing these Jews. And when he starts doing that, I would like to think somebody might stand up and say, hold on. We got you, we got rid of that runoff primary for you, but I'm not for sure if we should go this direction. As far as I know, he hasn't done anything like that. But that's the fear of, totalitarian fascism. Even if it's in favor of the poor, what stops it from being corrupted by another party? Someone else grabs the gauntlet and just, say, like Obama. A lot of people were, Republicans loved Bush when he had absolute power as president. Then Obama got absolute president because we're at war, so he could sign executive orders. But when he signed the executive order for the immigration, all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, it's not constitutional. We're at war. So the Constitution's fucking irrelevant when it comes to him and war decision-making powers. Barack Obama can do whatever the hell he wants to do in the interest of national security. He can do whatever the hell he wants to do. And so, get mad at the whole thing. Don't just pick, I'm mad now that, a black president's doing it. It was wrong when Bush was doing it. It's wrong still now. But the immigration law was the right. He said, send the criminals back and keep the hard workers. Yeah, you should do that. What cold-hearted, what's your suggestion? Ship them all back, right? So that looks like the Jews in the concentration camps. Just fill up a bunch of trains with a bunch of Mexicans and then just drive them across the border and just drop them off in a field. Here you go, Mexico. It's your problem now. And that's insanity. That would be horrible PR. The media should cover every bit of that from the time that they're kidnapped out of their homes to the time that they're dropped off in the middle of the desert. 1992 amendment changed a lot. It changed Section 70, the election of the governor and lieutenant governor, Section 71, Section 72, qualifications of the governor and lieutenant governor, Section 73, when terms of governor and lieutenant governor begins, Section 74, compensation of governor and lieutenant governor. The governor and lieutenant governor shall at stated times receive for the performance of the duties of the respective offices, compensation to be fixed by law. And then Section 95, the time of the election of elected constitutional state officers. There was one section that actually I was kind of blown away about. There's Section 99 of Kentucky's Constitution says all the local positions. So all the local positions is at regular election in 1998, and every 4 years thereafter, there should be elected in each county a judge of the county court, a county court clerk, a county attorney, sheriff, jailer, coroner, surveyor, and assessor, and in each justice's district, one justice of the peace and one constable who shall enter upon the discharge of the duties of their offices on the first Monday in January after their election, who shall hold their offices 4 years until the election and qualification of their successors. That's 10 local positions. What did the 1992 amendment change? They are messing with the 1891 language, the language of the original Constitution. And I don't even know what the original language was. Once they change it, they say, well, here's the date we changed it, but we don't know what the language was beforehand. And so that's a problem. I mean, these are, what did we get rid of a position? Did we add a position? What did we do in 92 with Section 99? What was the change? Does anybody know?